A small, knowing nod. "Just one?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Ethan hesitated. A few muffled chuckles rippled through the room. Other journalists exchanged glances, sensing the shift in energy. "Yes, English," he admitted, his confidence wavering. Melania's lips curved into a polite but firm smile. "I speak 5 languages," she said simply. "English, Slovenian, French, Italian, and German. My accent is a reflection of my knowledge, not a weakness." The silence in the room deepened. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He had come prepared to challenge her intelligence, to mock her for the way she spoke. But now he found himself on the defensive. Melania didn't stop there. She straightened slightly in her seat, her voice remaining steady and composed. "You say my background does not qualify me to speak on education," she continued. "That because I was a model, I do not understand the value of learning. But tell me, Mr. Crowley, do you believe experience is only gained in a classroom?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. Melania continued. "I have traveled to many countries. I have met world leaders, educators, and children in need. I have seen the gaps in education firsthand, and I have spoken to those who struggle because of them. My experiences do not come from reading about these issues. They come from witnessing them, from engaging with the people affected." Her words hung in the air, each one deliberate. "And tell me, Mr. Crowley," she added, her eyes unwavering, "how many schools have you visited? How many children have you spoken to about their challenges?" Ethan's face tightened. He glanced around the room as if searching for support, but none came. The energy had shifted. The smirks were gone. The other reporters were silent, watching. Melania let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. "You say I should not be discussing education, but I have built initiatives that support children's learning and mental health. I have worked with educators, with families, with professionals. I do not speak about these issues from a distance. I work to find solutions." Her voice remained calm, without a hint of anger or defensiveness. "If my past as a model is a reason to dismiss my work, then perhaps we should ask ourselves, should we judge a person's ability to lead by their past or by their actions?" The weight of her words filled the room. A few reporters nodded subtly. Others scribbled down notes, their headlines already forming. The cameras clicked, capturing the moment. Ethan, however, had nothing to say. For the first time, the man who prided himself on always having a sharp remark, a witty comeback, was silent. His usual smirk was gone. Melania waited, giving him a chance to respond. But when it became clear he had no words, she simply nodded. "Next question?" she asked, turning her attention back to the room. The moderator, sensing the moment had passed, quickly gestured for another reporter to speak. Ethan slumped back into his chair. He had come expecting to challenge her, to expose what he believed was an unqualified woman speaking on topics beyond her reach. Instead, he had been left speechless. Melania had done what few could. She had taken an attack meant to embarrass her and turned it into a lesson in composure, intelligence, and strength. The next morning, the headlines were not about her accent. They were not about her past. They were about how she had silenced a journalist with nothing but grace and truth. At first, the room had been filled with quiet amusement. Some reporters had smirked when Ethan Crowley made his remark about Melania's accent. A few exchanged knowing glances as if they expected her to stumble or react emotionally. But now the atmosphere had changed. The moment Melania responded, the mood in the room shifted. The smirks faded. The quiet chuckles died down. And one by one, people began paying attention in a way they hadn't before. The journalist, who had come in confident and ready to challenge her, now sat stiffly in his chair. His face, which had held a smug expression just minutes ago, looked uncertain. He had expected Melania to be flustered, maybe even defensive, but instead she had responded with poise, intelligence, and a quiet strength that caught everyone off guard. A murmur spread through the room. Some reporters nodded subtly, acknowledging the unexpected turn of events. Others shifted in their seats, glancing at their colleagues, as if silently confirming that they had all witnessed the same thing. Then someone in the back of the room clapped. It was a single, brief sound at first, but then another person joined in, and then another. Within seconds, the claps grew louder, spreading through the room. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was enough. Enough to signal that Melania had just won the moment. Enough to show that, despite whatever preconceived notions some may have had, she had earned respect in that exchange. Ethan Crowley. Clarity and professionalism in her responses. Then the microphone reached Ethan. He straightened his posture, adjusted his tie, and cleared his throat. "Mrs. Trump," he began, his voice carrying a deliberate air of condescension, "you've spoken about the importance of education and communication. But let's be honest. Many believe your own background doesn't exactly make you the best advocate for these causes." A hush fell over the room. The tone of his voice had shifted the energy in the hall. Some reporters exchanged uneasy glances, while others leaned in, sensing tension brewing. Melania's expression remained calm. She nodded slightly, indicating that she was listening. Ethan smirked, sensing an opportunity to push further. "I mean, considering your history as a fashion model, and, well, the fact that English isn't even your first language, do you truly think you're the right person to be discussing educational reforms?" A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Some journalists scribbled furiously in their notepads, while others murmured among themselves. A few smirked, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Melania sat still for a moment, her hands delicately folded on the table. The insult was blatant, an attack on her intelligence, her accent, her background. But she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Instead, she slowly tilted her head, locking eyes with Ethan. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Crowley," she said, her voice steady. "How many languages do you speak?" The room fell dead silent. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected question. He hesitated, shifting slightly in his seat. "Well, One?" she interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Just English?" A few chuckles broke the tension. Some of the reporters who had been smirking before now exchanged amused glances. Melania continued, her tone measured and composed. "You see, I speak 5 languages. English happens to be one of them, so if my accent makes you uncomfortable, perhaps it is not my education that is lacking, but your understanding of what it means to be truly knowledgeable." A murmur of approval spread through the audience. Ethan's smirk faded. He opened his mouth as if to retort, but no words came out. Melania leaned forward slightly. "And as for my background," she continued, "I may have started as a model, but I have used my platform to advocate for causes that matter. I have spoken at the United Nations. I have visited hospitals and schools across the country. I have worked with children, families, and educators to understand their challenges and find ways to support them." She paused, letting her words sink in. "What I have not done is sit behind a desk and criticize others while doing nothing to help." A ripple of applause started somewhere in the room. At first it was subtle, but within seconds more reporters joined in. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had expected her to stumble, to react emotionally, to give him a soundbite he could twist, but instead she had turned the moment around, placing him under the spotlight. Melania gave him a polite, knowing smile. "Next question?" she asked, effortlessly shifting the conversation forward. The moderator, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, quickly directed the microphone to another journalist. Ethan sank back into his seat, his face unreadable, while cameras continued flashing, capturing a moment no one would forget. The headlines that followed the next morning weren't about Melania's accent, they weren't about her background. They were about how she had left a seasoned journalist speechless. The room was still, the tension thick. Reporters sat with pens poised, eyes flicking between the journalist and Melania Trump. The moment had taken an unexpected turn, and everyone was waiting to see how she would respond. Melania sat with an air of quiet confidence, her hands resting gently on the table in front of her. She didn't rush to respond. Instead, She let the weight of the journalist's words settle in the air. The question had been designed to embarrass her, to paint her as unqualified. But Melania was no stranger to such scrutiny. She looked directly at Ethan Crowley, her eyes unwavering. Then, in a calm, measured tone, she spoke. "Mr. Crowley, how many languages do you speak?" A flicker of confusion crossed his face. The question caught him off guard. He hadn't expected her to counter with one of her own. He cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. Well, English, of course," he said, attempting to maintain his composure. Melania gave. Figures who had been critical of her in the past acknowledged that she had handled the moment better than most would have. A well-known news analyst remarked on a live broadcast, "What we saw here was a woman who knows exactly who she is. She didn't need to lash out. She didn't need to argue. She let her words do the work, and it left the journalist completely speechless." The more people watched the clip, the more they realized that Melania had just turned the tables on the media, and she had done it effortlessly. For Ethan, the reality of what had happened finally began to sink in. At first, he had tried to defend himself. He had posted on social media, claiming that his intention was simply to ask tough questions. But the more he tried to justify his actions, the worse it got. His credibility had taken a massive hit. Other journalists distanced themselves from him. Some of his colleagues, who had once respected him, were now hesitant to associate with him. They didn't want their own reputations damaged by his mistake. One of his longtime mentors reached out privately and gave him some tough advice. "You need to own up to this, Ethan," he said. "You made a mistake. Stop trying to spin it into something it wasn't." It wasn't easy for Ethan to accept, but he knew his mentor was right. A few days later, he finally posted a genuine apology. "I deeply regret the way I handled my question at the press conference. It was unprofessional and uncalled for. I have always believed in holding public figures accountable, but I failed to do so in a respectful manner. I apologize to Mrs. Trump and to my colleagues in journalism." For some, the apology came too late, but others saw it as a step in the right direction. Still, the damage had been done. Ethan Crowley would never be seen the same way again. While Crowley was dealing with the fallout, Melania remained calm and composed. She didn't make any additional public comments about the incident. She didn't celebrate Crowley's suspension or engage in any further discussions about him. Instead, she moved forward, continuing her work and maintaining her usual grace. One simple tweet from her stood out: "Dignity always wins." It was just 3 words, but it spoke volumes. Her supporters saw it as a quiet but powerful message, a reminder that strength doesn't always come from fighting back, but from standing firm in who you are. Even those who weren't necessarily her fans respected her approach. A political commentator summed it up best: "Melania Trump didn't just win that exchange, she won in a way that nobody expected." She turned an attempted insult into a moment of strength, and that, more than anything, is what people will remember. As the weeks passed, the story gradually faded from the headlines. New controversies and political dramas took center stage, as they always did. But one thing remained clear: this moment had left a lasting impact. For Ethan Crowley, it was a harsh lesson in the importance of professionalism. His name would always be tied to that one press conference, a moment that had cost him dearly. For Melania Trump, however, it was a moment that elevated her in the public eye. She had walked into that press conference as the former First Lady. She had walked out as someone who had just set a new standard for handling criticism with grace. And in the end, that was the real victory. A personal remark about a politician's appearance. Reporters should challenge politicians on policy, not their looks or speech patterns, he had written at the time. The hypocrisy was clear. The internet didn't forget. While Ethan Crowley's name dominated headlines for all the wrong reasons, Melania Trump carried on with her schedule as if nothing had happened. The press tried to get a statement from her, but she didn't address the situation directly. Instead, she simply posted a brief message on social media. "Dignity always wins." It was short, simple, but powerful. Supporters flooded her comments, praising her for handling the situation with grace and composure. Even some people who had never been fans before admitted that she had gained their respect. One woman tweeted, "I never paid much attention to Melania before, but the way she shut down that journalist without even raising her voice, that was impressive." Another wrote, "No matter what side you're on politically, you have to admit, she handled that way better than most people would have." By the end of the week, the backlash had taken its toll. Ethan Crowley's employer announced that he would be taking a leave of absence. They didn't say whether it was temporary or permanent, but many believed it was their way of quietly removing him from the spotlight. Other networks avoided defending him. Nobody wanted to be associated with a journalist who had turned himself into the story. His career wasn't over, but it had taken a major hit. As for Melania, she had walked away from the moment stronger than before. She hadn't needed to demand an apology. She hadn't needed to call for consequences. She had simply responded with grace, intelligence, and confidence, and the world had seen it. And in the end, that was enough. As the days passed, the backlash against Ethan Crowley only grew. News outlets continued to cover the incident, discussing the deeper implications of what had happened. Some commentators called it a lesson in professionalism, while others saw it as a defining moment in how public figures respond to unfair criticism. Melania Trump, on the other hand, remained unbothered. She didn't issue any further statements or engage in any arguments. She didn't need to. The public had already seen her response, and it had spoken louder than anything else. For Ethan, however, the situation was far from over. Ethan's employer had initially tried to downplay the controversy, but as public pressure mounted, they were forced to take action. Their viewers, many of whom had been loyal followers for years, were demanding accountability. Some even threatened to stop watching altogether. Behind closed doors, executives were having serious discussions. They weren't just worried about public perception. They were also considering the integrity of their network. If they allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked, it could damage their reputation permanently. A senior editor made the decision. "We have to suspend him," he told his team. "There's no way around it. He didn't just ask a tough question, he embarrassed himself and, by extension, us." The announcement came the next morning. Ethan Crowley was officially suspended indefinitely. As soon as the news broke, reactions poured in. Some believed the punishment was justified. Others thought it was too little, too late. Good. Journalists should be held to a higher standard. You can ask hard questions without being disrespectful. It's not about politics, it's about professionalism. Crowley crossed the line, and now he's paying for it. I hope this serves as a lesson to others in the media. Do your job, but do it with integrity. Even some of Crowley's supporters struggled to defend him. While they had initially tried to argue that his comments were taken out of context, it became harder and harder to justify his actions. The internet never forgets, and as people dug deeper into Crowley's past interviews, inconsistencies began to emerge. One clip resurfaced from an old interview where Crowley had criticized another journalist for making a personal remark about a political figure. "We're supposed to challenge leaders on their policies, not their personal attributes," he had said at the time. The hypocrisy was undeniable. Crowley, who had once prided himself on being a respected journalist, was now the subject of scrutiny himself. While Crowley's career was taking a serious hit, Melania Trump was receiving a wave of support. Her social media pages were flooded with positive comments. Many people, including those who had never paid much attention to her before, praised the way she had handled the situation. One user wrote, "I've never been a fan of politicians' spouses, but Melania just earned my respect. She didn't get angry or defensive. She just responded with class." Another commented, "This is how you deal with negativity, with intelligence, confidence, and dignity. Well done, Melania." Even some media, weakest approach. As the days passed, Ethan's name began to fade from the headlines. But for those who had witnessed the exchange, the message was clear. Melania had not been the one embarrassed that day. She had stood her ground. She had responded with grace, intelligence, and confidence, And in doing so, she had turned the tables completely. The moment would be remembered, not as an instance of her struggling with a tough question, but as one of her strongest public moments yet. And for Ethan Crowley, it would be remembered as the day he underestimated Melania Trump and paid the price for it. As soon as the press conference ended, Ethan Crowley walked off stage with a forced smile. He could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him, but he still tried to act like everything was fine. Reporters around him exchanged quiet glances, some whispering to each other as they packed up their notes and equipment. But the real storm was only just beginning. Within an hour, major news networks were already talking about what had just happened. The clip of Melania's response was everywhere. At first, it started with a few reporters tweeting out the exchange, but it didn't take long before it went viral. Melania Trump shuts down reporter with classy response. Journalists' attempt to mock Melania backfires spectacularly. Ethan Crowley faces backlash over his comments on Melania's accent. On news broadcasts, the clip was played repeatedly. Some journalists attempted to downplay the incident, suggesting that Ethan was just asking a tough question. But others were quick to call it out for what it was, an unnecessary and unprofessional moment. A well-known political analyst shook his head as he watched the footage during a live segment. "This wasn't journalism," he said firmly. "This was a personal attack disguised as a question, and Melania handled it better than most politicians would." Another panelist nodded. "Look, we've seen public figures struggle with tough press conferences before," she added. But this was different. She didn't lash out. She didn't get flustered. She just turned the moment around and left the journalists scrambling. While the media debated the moment, the internet had already decided. On Twitter, thousands of users flooded the platform with their thoughts. Some were longtime supporters of Melania, while others admitted they weren't necessarily fans. But they all agreed on one thing: Ethan Crowley had crossed the line. I don't care what your politics are, mocking someone's accent in a professional setting is just bad journalism. Melania speaks 5 languages. How many does Ethan Crowley speak? He thought he was going to embarrass her, but she ended up making him look like a fool instead. Even some of Crowley's usual supporters hesitated to defend him. Many journalists understood that professional credibility was everything, and defending an obvious mistake would only damage their own reputations. One columnist wrote, "There are countless ways to challenge a public figure. But when a journalist resorts to personal jabs instead of legitimate questions, it weakens the entire profession." Ethan Crowley, who was usually active on Twitter, was noticeably silent. As the backlash continued, it wasn't long before Crowley's own news organization was forced to address the situation. By the next morning, an official statement was released. At News Network, we take journalistic integrity seriously. While we encourage our reporters to ask hard-hitting questions, we also expect professionalism and respect in all interactions. The remarks made during yesterday's press conference do not reflect the values of our organization. It was the network's way of distancing itself from Crowley's mistake. Inside the newsroom, executives were already discussing the impact. Viewers had started flooding their email inboxes with complaints. Some were longtime watchers who now threatened to stop tuning in if the network didn't take action. One senior producer sighed as he scrolled through the flood of emails. "We can't afford this kind of mess," he muttered to his colleague. By midday, rumors were already circulating that Crowley might be suspended or at least pulled off political coverage for a while. With his reputation quickly falling apart, Crowley finally broke his silence. He posted a tweet trying to justify his words. "My job as a journalist is to ask tough questions. I never intended to offend, only to challenge public figures on their qualifications." But nobody was buying it. The responses came fast. Tough questions are fine. Mocking someone's accent isn't. You weren't asking a question. You were making fun of her. Journalism is about facts, not cheap insults. His tweet, which was supposed to calm things down, only made them worse. A few hours later, another tweet surfaced, a clip from 2 years ago where Crowley had criticized another journalist for making looked around, his expression tightening. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had expected the room to laugh with him, to enjoy his clever remark at Melania's expense. Instead, he was now the one being watched, not with admiration, but with judgment. A female reporter leaned over to her colleague and whispered, "That was actually impressive." A journalist from a major network scribbled furiously in his notebook. He had planned to write a piece about how Melania had struggled to answer tough questions, but now that angle no longer made sense. The camera operator zoomed in on Melania, capturing her composed expression. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or show any sign of arrogance. She simply waited for the next question, as if nothing unusual had happened. The moderator hesitated for a moment before clearing his throat. "Next question?" he asked, bringing the conference back on track. But the moment was far from over. For the online reaction, a viral moment. As soon as the press conference ended, the clip of Melania's response began circulating online. At first, it was just a few reporters posting snippets on Twitter, adding their own surprised reactions. Say what you want about Melania Trump, but that was a masterclass in handling a hostile question. This is how you shut down an ignorant remark, with facts, not emotion. But within hours, the clip had exploded. Major news networks picked it up, playing the exchange in their segments. Social media platforms were flooded with debates. Some people still clung to their old criticisms, but many, even those who weren't necessarily fans of Melania, admitted they were impressed. A political commentator on a major talk show shook his head in disbelief as the clip replayed. "Look, I'll be the first to say I've been critical of the former First Lady," he admitted. "But let's be honest, she handled that situation better than most politicians would." The host nodded in agreement. "It's rare to see someone keep their composure that well," she added. "She didn't lash out, she didn't get defensive, she just turned the question around and made him look foolish." Meanwhile, Twitter was flooded with reactions. Whether you like her or not, Melania Trump just owned that journalist. That was pure class. The journalist wanted to embarrass her, and instead she ended up making him look unprepared. Imagine thinking you can mock someone for their accent when they speak 5 languages. Yikes. Even people who had never paid much attention to Melania before were sharing the clip, admiring the way she had handled the situation. Ethan Crowley, on the other hand, was facing a different kind of response. His own social media pages were filled with comments. Many people called him out for his attempt to embarrass Melania. Others questioned why a professional journalist would resort to mocking someone's way of speaking instead of focusing on real issues. One tweet, which quickly gained thousands of likes, summed it up perfectly. "Journalists are supposed to ask tough questions, not make cheap jokes. Ethan Crowley just embarrassed himself on national television." News outlets began running stories not about Melania's accent, but about the journalist's unprofessional behavior. Headlines read, "Reporter faces backlash after mocking Melania, then getting shut down." "Melania Trump turns the tables on journalist in viral exchange." When a reporter tried to embarrass Melania, she left him speechless instead. The reaction was overwhelming. What had started as a moment of mockery had completely backfired. Instead of damaging Melania's credibility, it had strengthened it. In the days that followed, Ethan Crowley found himself at the center of controversy. His network received numerous complaints from viewers, criticizing his approach. His employers, though initially silent, eventually released a carefully worded statement distancing themselves from his remarks. "We encourage our journalists to ask tough, fair questions. However, personal remarks that detract from meaningful discussion are not aligned with our values." It was the corporate way of saying you went too far, and now we're dealing with the consequences. Ethan himself tried to defend his comments, posting an explanation online. "My intention was never to offend, but to challenge public figures on their qualifications." But nobody was buying it. The responses flooded in. Challenging qualifications is fine. Mocking accents isn't. You thought you'd humiliate her, and now you're playing victim? Please. She spoke 5 languages. You spoke nonsense. Even fellow journalists were reluctant to defend him. Many of them knew that the profession already faced criticism, and defending a moment of unnecessary rudeness would only make things worse. One well-known columnist wrote, "There are plenty of ways to challenge a public figure. Resorting to personal attacks, especially on something irrelevant like an accent, is the grand hall of the Metropolitan Hotel was filled with the hum of conversations and the clinking of glasses. The event was one of the most prestigious political galas of the year, attended by influential figures from various industries. Cameras flashed as prominent guests made their way down the red carpet, stopping briefly for interviews. Among them was Melania Trump, exuding grace and confidence in an elegant cream-colored gown. She moved through the crowd with poise, her warm smile unwavering despite the sea of reporters eager to capture her every move. At the other end of the room, a well-known journalist, Ethan Crowley, adjusted his tie as he sipped his champagne. He was infamous for his sharp tongue and relentless questioning. His columns often carried a sarcastic edge, and tonight he saw an opportunity to create a headline that would dominate the news cycle. As Melania approached the main stage, where dignitaries were gathering for an official address, Ethan smirked, turning to his colleagues. "Watch this," he muttered, stepping forward. With a microphone in hand, he cleared his throat and called out, making sure his voice carried over the chatter. "Mrs. Trump, over here. A quick question, if you don't mind." Melania paused, gracefully turning toward the voice. She acknowledged him with a polite nod, signaling that she was willing to answer. Ethan took a step closer, holding his microphone up. "You've had an interesting journey, going from modeling to the White House. But tell me, do you ever feel out of place discussing political matters, given your background?" The room quieted slightly, and a few murmurs spread through the audience. Some attendees exchanged glances, recognizing the subtle jab hidden in his question. The implication was clear. He was questioning her intellect, her place in the political world. Melania, however, remained calm. She took a small breath, allowing a slight pause before answering. "I believe everyone in this country, no matter their background, has the right to speak on important matters. After all, America is built on diversity, isn't it?" Ethan wasn't satisfied. He leaned in slightly, pressing on. Of course. But let's be honest, you weren't exactly involved in policy discussions before the White House. Some critics say you were just along for the ride. What do you say to that?" A few chuckles rippled through the press area. Ethan folded his arms, certain that he had backed her into a corner. Melania tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. She took a moment before responding, ensuring her words were measured. "You know, that's an interesting perspective. But tell me, Mr. Crowley, when was the last time you stood in a position where the world judged your every move, your every word, your every effort to make a difference?" Ethan's smirk faltered. Melania continued, her voice steady and composed. "I did not enter politics to satisfy critics. I focused on initiatives that I believed could help children, families, and communities. Whether people choose to acknowledge that or not is their choice. But I know the work I've done, and I stand by it." The room fell completely silent. Even those who had smirked moments earlier now seemed to reconsider. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. He had expected a nervous deflection, maybe even an irritated response, but not this. A few reporters in the back whispered among themselves. Others took notes, realizing they had just witnessed something unexpected. Before Ethan could recover, Melania gave him a polite but firm smile. "I appreciate your question," she said smoothly, before turning and walking away toward the stage. The silence was broken by a quiet murmur of approval from some guests, followed by a few claps. The respect in the room had visibly shifted. Ethan remained standing, his face blank. He had come prepared to challenge her, perhaps embarrass her. But instead, he was the one left speechless. The press conference hall was packed with journalists, photographers, and media personnel. Bright camera flashes flickered as reporters jotted down notes, their recorders capturing every moment. The air buzzed with anticipation as Melania Trump took her seat at the front, poised and composed, her signature grace evident in every movement. The event had been called to discuss a new initiative she was supporting, focusing on children's education and mental health awareness. The room was filled with reporters from every major news outlet, waiting for their turn to ask questions. Among them stood Ethan Crowley, a journalist well known for his sharp critiques and pointed remarks. He had built his reputation on challenging public figures, often using sarcasm and wit to expose what he called the truth behind the image. Tonight, he was determined to make headlines. As the microphone was passed around, questions ranged from policy details to funding and execution. Melania answered each one with patience, ensuring